So I'm really, really pleased to, we talked about, we had a panel earlier in the day where I had a bunch of lawyers up here talking about, no offense to the lawyers, I am one myself, and I see some of them still in the room, where we had lawyers talk about decentralization and DAOs and what that means from a legal standpoint. We're really privileged to have two technologists here to talk about that. And I will tell you that if you're wondering why you're seeing me again, it's because COVID, and we lost one of our panelists at the last minute. So, but I promise there'll be drinks and pigs in a blanket afterwards. So we have, yes, thank you very much. Real ones too, Mark, the American kind. So we have Gene Hoffman, who's CEO and president of the Chia network, and Bryant Eisenbach, who's CEO of ApeWorX. And funny story about Bryant was we met each other in person yesterday and we chatted for a while and he acted as if he knew me. And it turned out we had actually been members of a Telegram group for 2 years, and I only know him by an animal PFP. I'm not going to dox you, I promise. But that's kind of the world that I live in, right? And Mark, do you, an animal PFP, like a picture of a cartoon animal, basically. Yes, so there you go. So we have, I want to talk about the through line for me, which I mentioned at the beginning of the day, was decentralization, what it means. And like I have in my mind, and did anybody here read Foucault's Discipline and Punish in college? Yeah. So Foucault talks about this concept of a panopticon, right? Of a prison where you've got like a central tower that looks at everything. And he sees that as sort of a metaphor for modern power. And I think of when I think of decentralization, I woke up this morning thinking about Foucault. I think I mentioned I had Szechuan food late, and I'm probably pretentious and slightly nerdy. But I've been thinking about decentralization, what it means. Is it an answer to the Jeremy Bentham panopticon, to Foucault's panopticon? Does it create sort of a more of a distribution of power? So let me begin by asking you, I want to talk, Gene, I mentioned PGP before, and Gene came up afterwards and he said, I know you were talking to me. I actually want to go back and talk about that as part of your origin story, sure, pre-crypto, because it's really, really fascinating. But when you talk about decentralization as people who are building technology, what does that mean to you? Bryant, let's start with you. Like, what is it? What's the purpose? Is there an end to it? What does it mean when we're talking about blockchain technology?
I think decentralization is like kind of an amorphous term a lot of people throw around, and it's undefined, maybe purposely so, because it's like thought-provoking, right? But like one of the ways I don't think a lot of people think about, because it's more technically oriented, is like, what is technical decentralization? Well, it's the like making your infrastructure more robust by spreading it out across multiple like operators or nodes or areas, so that, you know, if you have a problem in one area, the whole system doesn't come down, right? So I think that's a good like fundamental like technical definition of the term, but it creates emergent properties in like different realms, like politically or economically, like what can it add in value there? And I think that's where it engages a lot of people in thought.
And what are you building at ApeWorX?
ApeWorX, we're a Python-based developer infrastructure company. So we're most famously known for Ape, which is an open source framework for smart contract developers and people working on the edges. We're currently building the cloud-based platform called Silverback, which will allow Python developers to really easily kind of deploy applications that interact with and respond to events that occur on blockchain networks. Useful for a lot of different things, either developer-facing or maybe stuff like automated trading, market analysis, things of that nature. So it's kind of a broader infrastructure play. We think that Python is like one of the most accessible languages in the world for a lot of the types of activities you'd want to do in crypto, like data science, artificial intelligence, machine learning. A lot of security work happens in Python, and a lot of automation. So those are kind of the things that we're interested in targeting.
Much more elegant language than Solidity, too, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a lot easier to learn. Most people, when they go to college now, they learn Python in their computer science courses, so it's a very accessible language.
So, Gene, let me ask you, it's almost like a book title. What are we talking about when we're talking about decentralization?
I mean, fundamentally, we're talking about pushing power out to individuals. This all started with, Diffie, Hellman, Ravesh Shamir, and Alderman, RSA, and Diffie-Hellman Key Exchange. It was the idea that instead of nation states being the sole place where communications could be secured, it could be secured by anyone, anywhere. And that sort of led down a long road from the cypherpunks, who were originally kind of the core group that moved to put anonymous remailers and identity and NIMS and how do you fight Sybil problems, how do you prove you're not a dog on the internet. Decentralization was the final step to really go and say, hey, can we have a system that actually has economic value in a way that cannot be replicated or duplicated in a computer environment where you can copy anything. And so decentralization was a means to an end to create the ability to have trust in people you would never meet or trust at all. So it is really about having control in a way that you haven't had in the past. And in fact, what decentralization fundamentally does from a blockchain perspective is narrow the need for regulation. It doesn't remove it at all. People are still people. But the technology makes it so that many of the things that have historically been the bad things people do to bad people or good people can't be done. So it's a very different paradigm, and it started with strong cryptography.
And that concept of spreading power out to individuals, I mean, that hasn't met with a warm reception by U.S. regulators. I don't want to talk about technically how we deal with that. So there were a couple of consent orders issued by the CFTC earlier in the year involving I think it's OPYN, I don't know how it's pronounced, Deridex and the OX platform. And basically, anybody here familiar with those orders? You know what I'm talking about? I'm sure a couple of lawyers could. Basically, what happened was these people had websites, and the websites allowed consumers in the United States to, I'm oversimplifying slightly, trade derivatives. Now, you can really only do that in the United States if you're subject to an exemption or you register with the National Futures Association, with the NFA, which is an SRO that gets power from the CFTC. Well, they didn't do that. One of the websites said, well, we blocked IP addresses, and the CFTC said that's not actually good enough. But what they did was, and this happens often, they said, well, we're just a website. We provide access to on-chain smart contracts that allow for, peer-to-peer trading. And there's the fight with regulators now is, I think, sort of about that. The concept of, well, just because there's this stuff that happens on the back end, if you've got a website that allows for access to it, we're going to regulate you as well. So I guess the question then is, how do you meet that regulatory challenge, and how are you doing that? Maybe talk a little bit about Chia and how Chia works to do that.
Yeah, and look, there's three eras to get to Chia. So first of all, there's the cypherpunk era where we were looking at these problems and actually going and pushing back on those regulations. I mean, the crypto wars part one was shipping PGP. I'm one of the three people who figured out how to end export controls in cryptography, and I was the youngest, least to lose, whose idea it was. So I was the one who exported PGP the second time in book form.
Tell people, I imagine that most of the people here don't know that story. So what was that about? So
originally, Phil Zimmerman was famously investigated for exporting strong crypto. And this is the part of the ITAR, which is equivalent to exporting nuclear weapons. So this is a 20-year federal felony. It is not a small thing to play with. Essentially, the DOJ backed down and PGP Inc. was formed. My company was the second company they bought. And while we were there, we were basically stuck with these export controls, and we wanted to have a global business to support customers like Boeing and others. And the question was, how the heck were we going to do that in a way that was legal? And it became very clear to later co-founder of eMusic, Bob Cohn, and I. Bob was Borland GC, won Borland Billy Lotus, et cetera, that if we put it in a book, and that book had easy scanning capabilities, and if that book were to be shipped out of the United States, that's First Amendment activity. And so we put a book in the Library of Congress, Printers Inc. in Palo Alto. Things weren't moving so fast, so I brought one with a FedEx envelope on it, and handed it to a guy named Lucky Green at the Cypherpunks meeting in San Mateo, California. And it showed up in, I believe, Switzerland about 3 days later. They cut the bindings off, put it in a scanner, and recreated PGP from book. This led to the Commerce Department investigating me for about 4 months. Thankfully, Bob did not tell me how deep that went. And then we have our new modern Commerce Department open source strong crypto regulations, which is, I can't remember if it's $5 or $15, fill out the form, answer some questions, and you're done. So since then, the crypto wars have been that source code is free speech. Now, we've not had like a Supreme Court case that gets there, but we've had quite a few district court cases and courts of appeal cases that say, look, certainly source code is. There's an interesting question still out there about whether executable code is or not. But, you know, we saw an FBI versus Apple, kind of the second iteration of this, where FBI is trying to tell Apple how to design their software, and Apple says, no, thank you. And the founder of Chia is a guy you may know as the guy who created BitTorrent. And BitTorrent, certainly Hollywood and the copyright industry absolutely wanted decentralized peer-to-peer sharing to stop, but it is unstoppable. And it actually raises almost all of the same questions. If you have a website that links to torrents that are illegal, can you be held liable for the link to the torrent, even though you're not hosting the torrent? Bram Cohen looked at the current state of the art here, and you know, we suspect Satoshi's a few people who were friends of ours, ex-cypherpunks, ex-PGP folks. There were problems, and there are 3 things we went and did very differently. We launched a new layer 1 blockchain about 3 years ago. That was after about 5 or 6 real years of R&D. First of all, you had to solve for proof of work. Proof of work is a horrible, wonderful, bad, but works idea. And it's the only way to then date to solve a problem for real. Proof of stake is technology's proof of work was invented to fix. The other thing is that Bitcoin is mostly right about all of its security assumptions and how it works, but it does not have smart contracting. And so you need a smart contract environment that is in the Bitcoin style to be able to resist the North Koreans stealing $1 billion a year from badly written smart contracts. And then finally, I'm an ex-public company CEO, and I looked around at 16 and 17, illegal underwritten offering, illegal public offering. This all looked wrong to us. So we engaged the SEC early. We currently have an S1 on file confidentially and filed our second amendment of that about 2 weeks ago. And it's important to dive in just a touch about what smart contracts mean, because first of all, to solve proof of work, we invented proof of space and time. It is proof of unused hard drive space. The way to think about it is you fill some unused hard drive space with lottery tickets, and then you listen to the network, and it announces a bingo number, and you go look in your numbers and go, oh, I'm close enough, I win a block. So your hard drives kind of sit idle as you listen to the network. It's proof of work. So you go and do the proof of work at first. Now, this was necessary to get out of all of the ESG questions about using a tremendous amount of power as you scale Bitcoin up 10x or 100x from here, because that's what you have to do to make it core financial rails. But the real power is in smart contracting. And so in the Bitcoin style, well, the difference is that people today think about Ethereum when you think about smart contracting. Ethereum smart contracts are monolithic, centralized smart contracts. And so that means to do a peer-to-peer transaction, it's peer to maybe stolen from, or the North Koreans haven't hacked it yet, smart contract to peer. In Bitcoin and Chia, the intelligence is in each coin. So it's each individual element. You have an NFT, that NFT is its own thing. It is then encoded to be controlled by your private keys or your vault. And so you cannot have these kinds of situations where a single
Can I actually stop you for a point of clarification? For the most, probably there are very few people in the room who are as technical as you. Are you saying, as part of what you're saying, and I'm sure if there are Ethereum fans here, they may disagree with you, you're saying fundamental difference between Chia and Bitcoin on the one hand and Ethereum on the other hand is that Ether is fungible? Each ETH is the same and that each Bitcoin is different?
When you have a balance in Ethereum, you have a list on a smart contract.
Okay.
And if you want to like move a Bored Ape, everybody who wants to move a Bored Ape has to interact with the single smart contract that is the Bored Ape smart contract. This is bad for a bunch of reasons. Reason number one is, did the developer actually let go of control? Reason number two, does the developer not know that he didn't let go of control, but the North Koreans found where he didn't and are therefore about to drain the contract? And reason number three is, and now everybody has to interact with the same contract all the time. You know, the USDC contract, the USDT contract get tremendous volume. In Bitcoin and Ethereum, if you want to trade an NFT with somebody, and there's 1,000 versions
I
of
mean,
your NFT.
Bitcoin and Chia.
Bitcoin and Chia, thank you. You're only going to trade one of those NFTs, and the NFT logic is in that thing that you control on the blockchain. And so you and the person you're trading with only interact with your two coins effectively. It's a very different paradigm, and it is truly peer-to-peer. So in both Bitcoin and Chia, you can do what we call offers. It's a much more feature-rich thing than partially signed Bitcoin transactions. The idea here is I can say to you, hey, I'd like to buy 100 tons of carbon offset from you, and I'll offer $700 of USDC for that. And I will sign a partial transaction that offers a real coin I have and creates from scratch that carbon offset. I can post that on a website. I can email it. I can include it in an SEC comment letter for an equity offering to make the entire Federal Registry an exchange under the SEC's then definition of exchange. But anybody who sees it can take it. They can go, yeah, I'll sell you that, and I've got that asset, and therefore I can sign that in. When I sign that in, it creates a transaction. It'll go through on the chain. I submit it, and in a couple minutes, I have finality. Very different paradigm. You're talking about one market. Anybody who sees these things can immediately interact with them in a safe way without counterparty risk, without escrow. The blockchain is your escrow. And you do things like have them time out so that you cannot spend them after a certain block height. So you really have the ability to just use communication channels to make a limit order book for anything, be it wine, be it a commodity, be it an equity.
So, Brian, I'm curious what your thoughts are on that, if you agree with or disagree with that. And also, a question that I have too, which is I think related to this concept. I think when people say peer-to-peer, sometimes they're misunderstanding what they mean. So first, I'd be interested in your reaction to Gene's comments, which I think for some people would be considered, I don't know, inflammatory? That would be, but would be...
I think he gets to it right at the end. So like a limit order book, right? It's a very traditional like financial system way of representing that, like a list of orders and offers, right? Like a lot of the innovation that's taken place in the Ethereum space has been more like pooled investment vehicles, if you can think about it that way.
Yeah.
So you create things like Uniswap, which are very popular, or Open, which I think was really interesting. They're pooled inside of a single smart contract so that when you do an order or an action against that, you're getting the current stateful, like the state will change in that contract as a bunch of activity happens to it. And you're getting the current like fill price at that stateful instance.
Is it a thing? I mean, are those things that are being built without, is it correct to say there's no intermediary in that transaction?
Well, you can say the intermediary is a software program, which depends on your definition of software program, I guess.
I guess. So what it comes back to also is, I think about those CFTC orders, and I think about, I don't know, the SEC's, apparently the Uniswap received a Wells notice. So there's this sort of fundamental threshold question about whether you can build things that are decentralized, somewhat autonomous, and that you can actually act to on a peer-to-peer basis, and do so in such a way that is, there are two ways to say this. One, doesn't attract the ire of regulators, or two, is truly something that is not intermediated, so therefore doesn't have the risk that sort of our financial regulatory rules and regulations were created to protect against. So Gene, like using, I think we've talked about this at length before. How do you build, is it possible to build using Chia or otherwise in a way that gets around the front end risk, if you will?
Yeah, absolutely. The issue partially here is I do believe you can on Ethereum build something that is decentralized at some point. So in other words, when you look correctly at, say, the Tornado Cash contract, they seem to have correctly taken themselves out of the ability to upgrade that. But there's this very different architectural view, which is like you have these centralized developers writing a centralized smart contract that will live on the blockchain forever, versus saying, your assets are yours, your assets can be restricted in the way that you want them to be restricted. There is source code on the web to show you how to build the equivalent of Uniswap using coins. But in a very different way, the way you activate a pair in Chia on a Uniswap style swap is that anyone can spend it. So literally anyone who can see the blockchain can go, hey, I'm going to do this. And the coins themselves say, hey, I only spend as long as I meet the Uniswap rule effectively. And so again, you now have this truly decentralized infrastructure. And in a lot of ways, I think about it like Napster versus BitTorrent. For people who dug into Napster, the reason Napster didn't do it right was because it had a centralized directory kind of hiding in the middle of Napster. Where with BitTorrent, there is no centralized directory, there is no centralized entity, there is no one to tag. Now, it's not Napster in that I do believe you can do it right on Ethereum. And the key is making sure that multiple front ends exist. You know, one of the things we do on Chia is we have this thing we call data layer, which allows you to basically kind of have some Git functionality directly on chain where you can basically say, hey, I'll download a front end to my desktop that gives me easy control of our Uniswap equivalent. And I can tell from the blockchain that the signed executable that I've downloaded, mirrored from some rando, is absolutely the one that I expected to be and was published by somebody I trusted.
Well, so let me ask you about that, taking it a little bit further, oversimplifying slightly, but the reason why we have the Securities Act of 1933 and the Exchange Act, the Investment Advisors Act, and the Investment Companies Act is because of, they came in part from blue sky laws. People were literally selling the blue sky, you know, the Great Depression, we all know the story. The rules, although they may be outdated now, they addressed a risk that people weren't getting full information about investments, right? So let's say, in theory, okay, we can, using technology, we don't need placement agents anymore. We don't need exchanges. We can use software. Well, let's further say, in theory, and you know, let's be creative, we can say, those statutes don't make any sense. You're not suggesting that this thing you've created has no risk, are you?
Not at all. And in
So
fact,
how do we manage that?
So I think it's very important to take the 33 Act separately from parts of the 34 Act and the 40 Act. The 40 Act may actually now be a dinosaur. There is no real reason, because custody can be self. Because a lot of the things that you're most worried about on settlement and other issues, blockchains are settlement engines. They're the best settlement engine we've ever created. And so there's a whole host of antiquated regulation that should not come forward. But the 33 Act is this new asset token that I've issued as security. Absolutely. People are still very, very good at convincing you. Now, I guess it's better that we've got WIF and Doge instead of blue sky. But there's no reason that those laws don't apply to the asset issuer themselves. And so as an asset issuer, you have to say, if you're an American, am I correctly following American law? You can now have the tools on the chain to let you do things with decentralized identity so that people can say, hey, I'm not American, and therefore I can automatically interact with you.
But it seems to me that doing that, the problem with people say they want to create a token, and they want it to have functional utility, but they're going to use it to raise capital. The problem with that token is that you can't really use it on a consumer gaming platform, right? Because the platform itself, if people are using that token that's a security, you have to build all sorts of other things. So doesn't that view of tokens and securities, doesn't it hamper innovation in a fundamental way?
Just because investors would like to have immediate liquidity without going through the 33 and 34 Act does not mean we should change the technology. Because if you want to have a technology where you have a company that issues a security-like token and a utility token, you issue two tokens. One's regulated, one's not. But the regulated one will require them to actually go do the steps that are necessary to get liquidity. That is the way we've all done it until we've all gone through the big elephant in the room and saying that we get immediate liquidity because it's a token and it's not a security.
What level of utility is enough?
It depends on whether it's a security in the first place. My point to you is that if you want to do it right, issue something that is absolutely a security, tokenize it. But then issue something that doesn't have any security at all, wasn't used to raise money, and is just the coin of the realm.
Nobody will want it.
Why would it have value?
That equity should, because otherwise what you're simply saying is there's no such thing as investment anymore. But investors want to invest money with the idea of that investment going up and then dumping it on retail. That's the world. And the 33 Act is still pretty quite clear about that, and on the core issues there, the SEC has not lost.
I guess my question, though, is if that's the case, then I think what you're saying is that the technology isn't going to do anything in a fundamental way to alter the need for a filing and a registration and disclosure regime.
Yes. Now, certainly there are things we can do to make it make more sense for the modern era. Plus, there's also the policy argument, because I ran a smaller public company back in the day of, SOX went too far. It's too hard to take a, $500,000 company public anymore, right? But those are at the margins. The core issue is if an investor invests money with the expectation of it going up, it's a security.
So, Brian, if you wanted to build something that was fully decentralized, that didn't have front-end risk. And by front-end risk, I mean the risk that the SEC goes to the website and says, yeah, I know you're not operating the smart contract. I don't care. Your website fits the definition of an exchange and exchange act. How would you go about, what would you do? This is not legal advice and this is not software advice. I'm just curious, using the tools that we have, how would you build that thing? What would it look like?
I don't know that you can completely defeat all that risk, I guess. Because it depends on the facts and circumstances of like the product you're offering and how you facilitate those actions, right, through the front end. So even like in Uniswap's case, Uniswap is one of the like prime examples on Ethereum of actually completely decentralized protocol. It's not controlled by Hayden and Adams or any person at Uniswap Labs. They cannot shut it down. They cannot change the fundamental trading engine that exists within the smart contract that processes trades, right? Like nothing can happen with it. But they do offer a front end that, they control. They're actively developing it. They add in they've added in certain features for like compliance purposes. They've added in like a data analysis component that can get you the best trade route for your trade because you can make many different options as you're selecting a trade. It has a functionality for like whitelisting or blacklisting specific sets of tokens, maybe some that have been already successfully accused of being securities or whatever.
And that's stuff that's built up. So I think we get to have drinks in about 3 minutes, so I can be apocalyptic, I think, to end this. But it is one of the profound things that we have here. And I think maybe some regulators get this. I think people who build software get it. What you're talking about is fundamentally unstoppable code. And I don't mean that in like a overly dramatic sense, and my question, we were talking about, people know the Kurt Vonnegut story called Ice 9? Anybody familiar with it? Yes, all right. So what's that? It was Ice 9. I don't think Ice 9 was in Slaughterhouse 5. I think it was a short story. It was in Cat's Cradle, that's right. So the concept of Ice 9 was it was the substance that froze anything that it touched, and it basically froze the entire universe. So when we're talking about, this is we can end an abstraction of philosophy because we have drinks soon. It seems to me like the risk, when we look at front ends I think
the risk exists because you're fundamentally translating like what is a back-end technology that should be accessible for the maximum amount of folks into something that can end up in a retail investor's hands and usage, right? So at that point, you're like transmuting the boundary a little bit into like what is the specific laws of the customers you want to serve, and maybe like the best end game scenario is like every legal jurisdiction has its own different front end.
Maybe, but how do you regulate unstoppable code? Maybe it shouldn't be. Well,
you don't.
You want Ice 9?
Do you want the FBI to be able to tell that they have to put a backdoor into the iPhone?
Does it mean the universe isn't going to freeze?
So far, BitTorrent has kept your streaming numbers down.
So my prediction, if I were to have one, is this is actually, one of the interesting things about blockchain technology is actually not the regulation about that software itself, is what it tells us about things like AI. Because that question about the ability to create unstoppable code, who has the risk for that, how will we regulate that, those are questions that we're going to be having to answer over the next 10 or 20 years. We have about a minute and a half left. I want to give people the opportunity to ask questions, if anybody has any. Yes, the gentleman in the tie, not this guy. Yeah, go ahead.
What about decentralized web hosting? Isn't that what you're getting at?
Yeah. It's already there. I mean,
So you can add that.
ultimately, you can put it up on a torrent and just download it, and anybody who knows what the torrent is can get the front end and just use it, right?
Yeah.
This is whack-a-mole. Right, this is whack-a-mole. And the answer is that ultimately the SEC will lose the whack-a-mole game, just like the recording industry lost the
flip
copyright.
side is like you are hosting that, so like kind of like when you were hosting music on.
Yeah. I actually had some of those
BitTorrent.
cases. I was local counsel in Missouri for a trade organization, and we went out and sued these kids, like in St. Charles County, for downloading stuff using torrent. I know I wore a black hat. I was a bad guy. I'm sad about it. It was like 25 years ago. But I saw Gdansky. You had a question.
Yeah, so I mean, you kind of run into the first advantage. If you're publishing something, generally the courts will take a page and view of script publication or either before or after fact. So you're like, well, I published it out there, and then you probably look to the earlier sites, come to Bryant or right? You'll see this, where like, we're going to publish this thing in a book.
Sure, there's a distinction between writing code and instantiating it. The question is, and Gene and I, we can talk about this over a drink, is,
Yep.
I mean, the First Amendment's old.
IMS versus Sorrel Health is very new.
What's that?
IMS versus Sorrel Health is very new.
I know.
And it basically says that all those speech restrictions on commercial speech are subject to strict scrutiny.
I mean, look at what happened with Citizens United. I mean, that was when the case got lost, when forgot who it was arguing in favor of state triangle and said, Kennedy said, does this mean that you could benefit from being published if it's too close to the election or force a publisher?
I think like
Yes. And that was it. That was in the case.
maybe one of the core like issues at play is like Ethereum is fundamentally a way to like deploy executable software. Or not even deploy, publish executable software. Like the only way you can instantiate it and use it is by calling it directly as a user. It
Still
doesn't.
speech.
If you publish that binary and nobody touches it,
Well, it's different than sending it to GitHub. The interesting thing, too, for lawyers who practice in this space is, in order to understand how the laws apply, you need to actually, like in any area of law, you can always hire experts, but there's this fundamental difference, right, between sending something to a GitHub repo where it's static and publishing it to a public blockchain. Is that instantiation?
the only difference is GitHub's owned by Microsoft.
Yeah, there really isn't that distinction anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the issue, is that executable code can be read by the people who know how to read, right? And once you're reading it, once you're publishing it, once you can put it on a federal docket or print it in a book,
Yeah.
it's speech.
Interesting stuff.